Y'all remember that thing Omegle? I don't know if it's still as popular as it used to be, or if there's just another version of it that people use, but for those that don't know, it's a website that puts you in a completely random, one-to-one chat room with people, either just text or with webcams too. When I was in my final year of high school, me and my buddies thought it was like the greatest thing ever after we talked 3 rando girls into flashing us one night. So as thirsty as it sounds, that's all we did for like a whole summer. Just chilling in one of our friends' mom's basements and just burning through different people all night. It got to the point where I'd go on Omegle sometimes when I got bored at home. Not to talk to girls as such, just to kind of mess around and see who was online. But I don't go anywhere near that site anymore. Not after seeing the most messed up thing of my life on there. Something that reminded me that the internet is still a pretty dark place sometimes, and that sometimes you can just happen across something seriously messed up, just on accident. So I have my webcam on, and I'm on a roll of just closing chat after chat. Everyone on that night was either a dude playing with themselves, a lonely weirdo, or someone legit mentally deficient, and I was just about to close that browser window out of sheer boredom when I see something that catches my eye. It's a girl, kneeling in a room lit solely with red lights. My first thought is that I might have gotten lucky, and that I was in for a little bit of a show. But then I saw the plastic sheet underneath her. Now, as crazy as it sounds, I had seen something like that before, when this older woman in a mask had a plastic sheet down and was urinating on whatever the stranger in the chat asked them to. Me and the guys had a good laugh at that one, but it was obvious that the idea was to make us laugh at that time or some other strange interests. But what I ran into that night was most definitely not designed to be humorous. I'm still watching it, wondering who this girl is, why she isn't wearing a mask when she's basically completely uncovered. Whatever was about to happen, though, she sure seemed nervous about it, like she was visibly shaking and trying her best to hide her face, not that she was doing a good job of it. It seems really dumb in retrospect, like the whole thing was giving off the worst vibes, but my dumb horny brain has me still thinking that this is some kind of weird fetish, and for some reason, when this masked dude appears on screen, that just cemented it for me. Some kind of weird BDSM thing was about to go down, and I wasn't mad that I was going to be the rando person to get to watch it. The dude walks up to the girl and puts a black bag over her head. She squirms a little, but other than that, I think she's still just nervous. Or maybe she was acting like that as a show for the audience. I mean, heck, maybe the dude liked her to act like that, who knows? People are weird. The dude then disappears from view before reappearing with a cordless drill. He makes a show of this, having a finger on the tip of the drill like a magician would all, "This is a real blade" type thing, and then walks around the back of the girl and grabs her by the head. Only then do I start to realize that this isn't quite what I thought it was, and that maybe, just maybe, I should close the freaking chat before I see something I end up regretting. But there was something about the whole scene, something about the way the guy was acting and how the girl didn't try to run away. It seemed like a setup, like it was designed to freak someone out. Even the red lights were sus, like I remember reading about how old Italian horror movies would tactically use red lights on set to disguise how terrible their fake blood looked. Something about it meant I couldn't look away. So, I was watching as this hulking, bare-chested dude grabs the girl by the head. She's tiny too, and the size difference means his hand is basically wrapped around her entire skull. He then fires the drill up twice to ensure it's working properly, and that's when the girl really starts to panic. It was also, coincidentally, the moment I started to panic too. Either this girl was doing a very good physical acting job, or her fear was real. And if her fear was real, it meant the whole thing was real too. She starts flailing and struggling so hard that the monster holding her had to lock a knee into the small of her back to keep her still. The way they fell, you could basically only see her head and her legs kicking behind them both. Like I said, I was almost certain the whole thing was fake, but the part that made me really doubt that was when what happened to the girl's legs when the guy started to push the whirring, spinning drill into the back of her head. First of all, there was the noise. It was absolutely stomach-churning. The sound of what could easily have been metal on bone just grinding against each other. But that could be faked, right? And there was this horrible mix of screaming and the drill's motor whirring, and the girl grunting as the pain started to hit. But again, could all be acting at the end of the day. What I'm almost certain you can't fake is the way this girl's legs started to spasm when the guy pinning her down started to really push that drill into her brain. They moved in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before, almost like people act in cartoons when they're being electrocuted. I got this sick feeling in my stomach and I immediately closed the chat window before I saw anything else. The whole thing left me really shaken up. Everyone I've explained what I saw to says they think it was faked too. But then again, I'm almost certain that's because I feed them so much info on how it could have been fake and not really on all the reasons why I think it could have been real. I think I actually just want people to tell me that. Tell me, stop freaking out. You fell for some elaborate prank that'll end up on the internet elsewhere. Because the alternative is just way too messed up for me to quantify. And a part of me still does think that I actually did watch a live snuff film that afternoon. I want to tell you guys that I later heard the cops found a body with a drill hole in the back of the head, or even that I read somewhere that it was just a prank, or even like a weird kind of viral marketing campaign or something. But the truth of the matter is, I just don't know. I never heard anyone else talk about the kind of thing I saw on Omegle that day, and I didn't ever go on that site again, so I didn't give myself a chance to catch a repeat performance, so to speak. I just try and tell myself that what I saw wasn't real, and that it was just an elaborate show to scare random internet strangers. That's what keeps the darker thoughts at bay when I'm reminded of it, and that's what helps me get to sleep at night. For a few years there, Omegle and chat roulette were like the best things ever. I know it sounds dumb, but the idea of coming face to face with random internet people absolutely terrified me at first. I wasn't the most confident of people when I was younger, and believe it or not, using stuff like Omegle actually helped me come out of my shell a little and learn how to talk to people. And naturally, like anyone who's spent a lot of time on Omegle, I have a lot of stories detailing some of the weirder encounters I've had on there. I mean, I've had some pretty amazing ones. I met one of my long-term gaming buddies on Omegle, and you'd be surprised at the number of girls who just want to show themselves off, so to speak, every once in a while. But I've also had my share of gross, sad, irritating, and downright scary encounters on Omegle too. And what I'm about to tell you is by far the most disturbing. And it's not some dumb creepypasta either. Every word of this is true. So I just gotten home from this terrible part-time job I was working in 2012, and at the time, my routine was get home, sneak one of my stepdad's beers from the garage, and see how palpable the mental illness was on Omegle that afternoon. I was actually having a good run at one point. I had a guy singing that Call Me Maybe song, another dude who did a magic trick, and a handful of pretty girls, and I think one dude was on acid or something. So all in all, I was in a pretty good mood by the time I hit end and knew for what turned out to be the final time of that night. Because when I do, I just see this dude sitting at his desk, staring blankly into the webcam. Immediately this hits me as unusual because most people are looking at their screens to see who you are and not straight up staring into the camera. I said "Hey, what's up?" or something. But the dude didn't reply, so I figured that there was just something wrong with his audio. Now I should add that it was usually around this time that I'd just end a chat and start a new one. If the person on the other end seemed too weird or like they wouldn't be much fun, I'd just skip them entirely. So as you can imagine, coupled with all the other weird stuff you're likely to see during an Omegle session, I ended up doing a lot of skipping. But something about this dude really got my attention. At first, when I saw him, he looked like he might be in his early to mid-teens, dark hair and eyes, kind of a baby face with scrawny shoulders. But the more I looked, the older he seemed to be. The guy had crow's feet, deep bags under his eyes. Pretty sure he had flecks of gray at his temples too. Like if he was as young as I thought he was, then he must have had the most brutal paper route in history. So for some reason, at a time I'd normally just ghost him, I said, are you okay, dude? Can you hear me? He nods. He could hear me, and it hit me that this might be another case of someone browsing Omegle while they're high. It might sound a little mean or whatever, but I figured that I'd just mess with him just a little bit. Maybe see if I could guess what kind of drug he was taking. I start talking real slow to him, trying to make him think time is slowing down or something, but he barely reacts. And it's then that I realize that he hasn't looked at his screen or monitor. The whole time he was literally just staring at this little lens on his webcam. I break from the play acting and just ask him straight up, "What kind of stuff are you on, dude?" He just shakes his head. So I ask him if he means he isn't on any drugs at all, and to that he nods. Now I'm torn between laughing because of what could have been a blatant lie and kind of freaking out because if he wasn't lying, and that was him sober, that made for one real creepy guy. And then out of nowhere, this guy reaches up towards his mouth like he's about to take out some gum or something. At first, I think he's going to show me some weird root he's been chewing on that made him look all sleepy. I mean, if there is such a thing, I was just kind of speculating. I know people can get some pretty weird South American plants and stuff from shady websites. But then it becomes obvious that he has hold of his own tooth. His front tooth, I think. Like in the grip of his thumb and forefinger. And then he starts to pull. I respond, "Dude, what are you doing?" All calm at first. And then he starts really getting a grip on his tooth, pulling it and twisting it. And I respond, stop! What are you thinking, man?" This all escalates until I hear like a deep cracking sound coming from this guy's mic. He twists the tooth free from his gum as blood starts to pour out of his mouth, then holds it up to the camera like he's all proud of himself. I am full-on squealing at the computer at this point, stuck between wanting to cover my eyes and turn it off, and not being able to look away because of what this guy is even doing. I asked him in like 100 different ways, "Why did you do that? Was it rotten? Can't you go to the dentist?" He doesn't say a word. He just spends a few more seconds smiling with this gap-toothed grin, mopping at the blood on his chin and holding up the tooth in front of the webcam. Then he disappears and I'm left on the new chat screen, just shell-shocked. Nothing has ever topped that for me in terms of just pure creepiness. Like I have so many unanswered questions about that guy, and each time I think I get close to figuring it out, it just opens me up to 100 other questions. I mean, he would have had to have been on drugs to be able to pull his own tooth out like that. I don't think anyone could stand the sheer agony. And it's also the whole idea that it wasn't his first time doing it. As crazy as it sounds, he seemed to just know what he was doing. That he had to twist it and wrench it. He knew exactly how to grip it. And then the sense of pride at the end. It all just gave me this distinct feeling that he'd done that kind of thing before. I didn't see anything else that ever made me react so strongly, and after that, all the random guys just sort of playing with their junk that you'd see didn't seem to faze me at all. Like as long as there wasn't any tooth pulling, it was just water off the duck's back. So, I guess I have something to thank Mr. Toothpuller for, although saying that it's not something I want to see again. In fact, I hope I never meet Mr. Toothpuller online, or in real life, ever again.
Snapchat was still pretty new when this story took place. It was sometime in late 2011. During my freshman year of high school, I had one really close friend. Her name was Samantha. Samantha told me one Friday before the weekend that she would ask for a friend request the next day. She thought it would be really cool if we bandwagoned on the Snapchat trend, the sooner the better, because Snapchat was almost non-existent at our school. And when I got home that day, I got a friend request. The profile picture was of Samantha. This was odd because she told me that she would invite me to her contacts the next day. Without hesitating, I accepted it. I figured she just got to it sooner. After I finished my homework the same day, I got a message from that account. 2 messages, in fact. They said, "Come to my house tomorrow, we can have a party." And the second was her address. I was really happy as I never went to her house before. We had just met earlier that year. And besides that, I wasn't often invited to parties. The address she gave me was to a house nearby, so I decided to walk over the next day. When I actually saw the house, I checked Google Maps multiple times to make sure I was led to the right destination. Because this place was very messy, and the windows were covered in those thank you bags you get at markets. Something didn't seem right. It was very modest for Samantha's family, yet we attended a private school. I realized the address was correct, so I knocked on the door, although I was a bit hesitant. It opened very quickly, and a man greeted me, almost like he was expecting me. He was about 6'3" with blonde hair. He really didn't look anything like Samantha, who was a short, black-haired girl. I asked if they were related. He simply said, "Yes." It was in a very plain and odd voice. Then I asked him about the bags on the windows, and he said it was because construction workers were still renovating the house. Before I could ask or say anything else, he beckoned me inside, moving aside so I could go through the doorway. I entered the small house. Sitting near a frayed couch was a large terrier, which he said they just bought a few days before I arrived. He told me to sit down while he went to get something. I checked the time on my phone, but the moment I grabbed it, it vibrated with a message. It was a notification from Snapchat. It was Samantha. It said, "Here is my Snapchat." And I thought things couldn't get weirder. She'd already sent me a request. Did she make another profile? Why would she do that? So immediately, as confused as I was, I messaged her back. "Your house is so weird. Where are you?" I said. "House?" she asked. "I have an apartment." My heart sank in my chest. Surely she was pulling my leg, just making a joke on me or something, I thought. "That's not funny," I messaged back. "Your dad's home. Where are you?" She didn't answer for a few seconds. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got an answer. An answer that confirmed everything. "What are you talking about?" it said. "My mom's been single for a while. I'm waiting for you by the door. Where are you?" I lower my phone, eyes wide and breathing funny. What do I do? Did I really just walk into a stranger's house? A stranger that had laid bait for me? That's when I hear whispering from another room. The man stepped out of the room with 2 other men. One was holding a thick black bag with his hands. Fully assuming the worst, I sprinted out of the house as fast as I could. Not once did I look back, even as I heard the footsteps behind me. Eventually, they faded away. I didn't stop running until I got back home, until I was inside the house with the doors locked. Once I finally got a breather, my chest never burned so bad before. My mom and dad looked worried when they saw me, and they needed an explanation. In between breaths, I tried to tell them. They got the gist of it, and they called the police. When the police got there, they were gone. That house had been abandoned. There should have been no one living there.
So here are the events that have transpired in the past 2 hours or so, and a little backstory as to why this is freaking me out so much. My partner and I have recently moved back into my childhood home with my parents, while our own house is being built to save some cash and not have to move instantly from our rental when it's complete. My parents own 3 Australian native birds, and earlier tonight I was updating my Snapchat story to show my friends, as many of them always ask what the birds' names are and what they look like. I took 3 Snapchat videos, one after the other, and just put them on my story without worrying about retakes or what I look like, so please forgive me for the uploads. Anyways, within about 15 minutes of uploading, I received an SMS message from one of my good, but not great friends that said, You bearded beasts, those birds are mad. By the way, the fuck was that in your window behind you in the last one?" I had no idea what he was going on about, so I went and watched my own Snapchat stories a couple of times. On the third or fourth watch, I saw what he was talking about, and my stomach sank. I almost started to have a panic attack, and I'm still pretty shaken up. I immediately saved my story videos and put them onto my computer to see them larger. In the last Snapchat video I sent, it kind of looks like someone is at the door, looking in, with their hands cupped against the door. It's hard to tell because Snapchat videos are very poor quality, and the door is only in frame for probably 1 second. Whatever is in the third Snapchat video, however, is definitely not in the first video when the door is in full view. I was the only person home at the time, and that particular door leads to the backyard, which is only accessible via a single locked gate. Here are the 3 videos I saved from my story.
So the first one of my parents' little birds is this little guy. It is little Leo. He's a cockatiel. The second little bird of my parents is a rainbow lorikeet. His name is Oliver. And there he is. And here I am with my good little mate, Puffin.
To add some backstory as to why this has me freaking out so much. To do that, I have to quickly talk about my childhood teenage years up until I moved out with my partner at age 18. From about age 8 until age 10, I had episodes of sleep paralysis, 1 or 2 times a month, where it felt like a weight was sitting on my chest and I couldn't breathe for about 40 seconds at a time. This led to insomnia and anxiety about bedtime, as I dreaded feeling helpless. I ended up seeing a child psychologist, and whether that was or was not the reason, the episodes largely went away, only once or twice a year until age 13. At age 12 or 13, for seemingly no reason at all, I started to get chronic episodes almost every night that lasted minutes to tens of minutes at a time. During these episodes, I could breathe, but couldn't move. The worst thing about these episodes, however, is that I felt like something was in the room with me and meant me no harm, common for people who experience sleep paralysis. At roughly age 14, things really took a turn, and I started to hear and see things during maybe 1 in 10 of my episodes, also pretty common for people who experience sleep paralysis. The things I heard were never too crazy and over the top, and were usually just thuds and creaks. However, when it came to seeing things, there was always one reoccurring thing: a faceless person looking into my bedroom window with their hands cupped to the glass. For the course of a 1 to 10 minute episode, this person would just stand there and look at me. Whenever the episode ended, the person would just be gone. Over the course of 4 years, this occurred quite regularly, but it always really made me feel totally helpless and terrified. I never got used to it. When I moved out at age 18, I never had another episode where I saw anything. I'm 26 years old now, and I very, very occasionally, once a year, have small, less than 30-second episodes, but only those in which I feel heavy-chested. To cut a very long story short, whatever is there in my Snapchat video looks almost 100% what I used to see as a teenager during my sleep paralysis episodes, and I have been a nervous wreck all night over it. To me, it kind of looks like a face to the glass and 2 hands on either side. It has scared the Christ out of me. What do you guys think? I'll try to answer as many questions as I can and respond to everyone that I can. Thanks a lot, guys.
I used to work in a 24/7 general store in a mall in South Carolina, so while the mall itself would close around 9:30, our store would stay open all night. There were 2 entrances to the store, one from inside the actual mall itself, and then a back door that people could enter through after the mall closed. Past 9:30, I would always have to shut the gate, separating the store from the mall. Given that this was a smaller store, it was never really busy in the deep night hours, which also made my job very uneventful most of the time. but there was one night shift that turned out to be anything but uneventful. It was towards the middle of my shift. The gate between the store and the mall was down, but I could still see through it obviously into the dark half-lit hallway of the mall. The mall always had night lights on, which were much dimmer but bright enough for the security guards to see what's going on in the cameras. I was doing my own thing, organizing the shelves, making sure everything was neat, when I heard a rattle at the metal cage. I looked and saw some guy standing on the other side, grasping the gate with his hands. At first, I thought it was a security guard on duty. It was the only logical explanation, even though it was rare to ever see them walking around. But as I got closer and asked if there was a problem, I realized it wasn't a security guard. It was just some random man. He was wearing a dirty black and white plaid shirt and very baggy blue jeans. Most notably though, and what made this exceptionally strange, was that he was just looking up at the ceiling. I inched a little closer and again asked if something was wrong and if he needed help, but he just kept looking up and shaking the gate. Now, there was some kind of protocol I was supposed to follow in the case of something like this in order to get the mall security. However, I didn't know how. I didn't know what number to dial, I didn't know how to work any kind of intercoms, so all I could really do was shut it out. I turned my back to the creepy man and went back to my register behind the counter, as far away from him as possible. Unfortunately, the shelves are angled perpendicularly to the counter, not parallel, so the man at the gate was in direct line of sight from me still. He finally seemed to back away, like literally walked backwards though, with his head still up at the ceiling. All that was going through my mind was where could security be? It was to my understanding that there would be at least one person watching the cameras at night. Anyway, I tried to just move past it, resuming my cleaning activities. I couldn't help but look back outside to the mall every once in a while though. Thankfully, he was gone now. Eventually, someone came into the shop. I heard the back door slide open. I was in between two shelves and couldn't see them, so I continued with my work. After finishing up sweeping the aisle, I went back to the register to wait for the customer. I saw the customer now. They were standing at the end of the last aisle to the left, the alcohol aisle. He was looking up. At first I thought he was looking at the top shelf, so I looked away. I only looked at him for maybe a second. I bent down under the counter to put the broom and dustpan underneath, and when I stood back up to look at the customer, I felt like my heart nearly stopped. He was looking at me with a smile, not a grin, but a wide-lipped smile. It also sank in right away now that this was the same man that was out in the mall from earlier, only now he'd apparently taken off his black and white plaid shirt. I stared at him and he stared at me, and I think this went on for 30 seconds. I didn't know what to do, and I had actually frozen up in fear. The face he gave, the smile, was a pure look of horror, something straight from a horror film or someone's nightmares. I felt like he stared into my soul. I opened my mouth to speak, and my voice trembled. I think I said, "Get out or I'm calling the cops." He didn't move. He didn't even bat an eye. I ran to the back room and locked the door so I could call my manager. She wouldn't pick up after several attempts though. When I gave up, I heard a tap at the door. Not a knock, just a very gentle tap. I sat like a nervous wreck in that back room for a good 5 minutes, wanting to be anywhere but there. But when the fear of this person stealing a bunch of items and losing my job became greater than the actual fear of the person, I stepped back outside and looked around. But the man was gone. He was gone for good this time. Our shop has cameras, so they caught all of it. When my shift ended, I told my manager about what happened and showed her the video footage. She was shocked and kind of freaked out herself. I only worked there for another month after that, then moved on. For the past 3 years or so, I've worked as an overnight security guard at a mall. It used to be that the mall didn't require an overnight person, but vandalism started to become a problem. Most of the time I would drive around the parking lot all night listening to my car radio. Now and then I'd kick some skateboarders out of the parking lot or investigate a suspicious person lurking about. Other than that, I'd say the job was pretty tame. Maybe 3 months in, I experienced something a little bit stranger. I noticed that the light to one of the shops was on while driving around the parking lot. This was surprising to me considering no one had snuck past me as of yet. So of course I parked the car and headed inside the mall to catch the potential thieves. As I approached the shop, I didn't hear the sound of anyone rummaging through the inventory. Sure enough, the shop was empty. As a matter of fact, even the security gate was still down. Only the shop owners had access to the security gates, so I couldn't really do anything about the light being on. I headed back out to my car. I'd say an hour went by with no incident, but as I was circling around the entrance to the mall, I saw another light was on inside. Inside the mall, it was the same scene repeated. The light was on to the shop, but the security gate was still closed. I even tugged on the damn thing to see if someone heard me coming and just hid from me. Nope, it was locked. I heard a click from behind me while investigating. The previous light was no longer on. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I swear I saw someone run behind the counter and hide. I think about now is a good time to mention I was running on 3 hours of sleep for the past 48 hours, and I was blaming these occurrences just simply on the lack of sleep. I shined my flashlight into the shop and scanned the area. Nothing that I could see. Behind me was another click. Once again, the light to the shop was off, and this time I know I saw someone standing in there. So I simply called out, "You can either leave with me or you can leave with the police." They didn't move, just stood next to the light switch. I approached the gate and turned my light in the direction of the light switch, and there was no one standing there. I did see that a clothes rack was fairly close to the switch, so maybe the light was catching the clothes just right and was casting a shadow. That was the most logical explanation I could think of, at least. I left the mall. I was pretty spooked from the events of that night, but after a few months, they were pretty much out of my mind. My patrols were nothing special for a while after that. I think my next incident happened around my 1-year anniversary as a guard. It was winter and I was inside of the mall checking the pipes. Yes, I was on security duty, but the owners decided to save a buck by having me inspect certain things as well. It was whatever. I was heading to one of the bathrooms to relieve myself when I heard a toilet flush. I jumped a little more than I would like to admit. Inside of the bathroom, I didn't see anyone. The toilets in the mall were motion activated, much like every other mall in the world. I checked all of the stalls, empty. I'll spare you the details, but after checking the stalls, I took a seat in one of them. I had a YouTube video playing on my phone while I was sitting. Then I heard a tapping sound coming from the stall next to me. I glanced to my left and saw a pair of shoes standing with the toes pointing towards me. Slowly, I brought my eyes up above the stall. Sure enough, there was the tallest man I'd ever seen standing over the stall, staring down at me. Had I not already been on the toilet, I would have been running home for new pants. When he saw me notice him, he ducked back down beneath the stall. I hopped up and kicked in the door to the neighboring stall. The damn thing was empty, except for a pair of shoes sitting in the same spot I had seen them. My heart was thumping like crazy. I went back to my car as quickly as possible after that. If I remember correctly, this happened at around 4 in the morning. Once again, I accredited all of this to my lack of sleep. I was just happy that I had the next day off.
My name's Missy D. As some of you may know, I've worked my butt off to pay my way through college. I did have a small amount of cash put back, but it wasn't near enough to get me through a whole 4 years. So, the moment I arrived in the dorms, I hit the bricks on a search for employment. It wasn't long before I scored a job at a small Italian-style fast food dive just off of campus. The place was owned by 2 guys who we'll call Joe and Tony. They had come to the States as teenagers and worked various jobs until they had enough money saved to throw together and open the restaurant. Even though they had the knowledge of Italian food and the look of 2 men from the boot, I believe they were actually Albanian by birth. Despite being very close friends, the 2 men were quite different from each other, and because of this, they would often butt heads. But the disagreements never grew violent. Tony was the fun one of the 2. Working with him was always enjoyable, and I did my best to make sure I was scheduled to work the same shifts with him. But school sometimes prevented this, and I was stuck working with Joe. He was almost the exact opposite of Tony. A shift didn't go by without him cursing out one of the employees, myself included. Half of the time, you didn't even know what he was calling you because it was in a different language, but his body language said it all. I can't count the number of times I wanted to quit, but I knew I couldn't let my ego screw up my life, so I swallowed my anger and kept my head down. I didn't know it at the time, but things were already collapsing behind the scenes, and I wouldn't have that job for much longer anyways. About a week before Christmas break, I went in one evening and saw that both Joe and Tony were in the restaurant. This was unheard of in the 6 months that I'd been working there, and I quickly noticed a heavy feeling in the air I didn't like. I clocked in as usual and went straight to work. The strangest thing was that Tony nor Joe was talking to anyone other than short questions and phrases. Although it was pleasant not to be yelled at by Joe, Tony's cold demeanor only served to make me even more uncomfortable. All of us did our best to do our job, and things were going well until around 9 that night. I'm not sure how it started, but Joe and Tony were standing at one of the sandwich stations speaking in Albanian. From their body language, I could see that it was one of their usual heated arguments, but instead of choosing to walk away as one of them often did, the argument grew more loud and aggressive. Even though we were doing our best to ignore the disagreement, we still had orders to fill and we needed to be in the same area from time to time as them. They had been arguing back and forth for about 10 minutes when I had to go to the walk-in to get some olives. Upon my return from the cooler, my focus was diverted by a loud phrase yelled out by Tony. I could tell from his tone it was something bad, and it must have been considering Joe's reaction to it. The whole time that they had been talking, Joe had been slicing sandwich toppings and waving his knife around with each word like a conductor's baton. However, when Tony said whatever he had, Joe's face went blank. For a second, he stood and stared with a look of disgust on his face. But then, in the blink of an eye, he plunged the chef's knife into Tony's chest. Naturally, I froze and didn't know what to do. A look of shock grew across Tony's face once he realized what had happened. He continued to stare at Joe for a few seconds before he said, "What have you done, man? No." Then he slumped to the ground like a bag of potatoes. Joe looked down at Tony as he bled out and continued to stare for a short moment. I didn't know if he knew I was standing behind them, so I did my best not to move. Another of the girls must have been coming from the front and witnessed the same thing. We stood still, looking at one another, trying not to draw Joe's attention. Her eyes were as big as saucers, and I imagine mine looked the same. I had no idea if he would come after the rest of us, and the sick feeling in my gut got worse and worse. Although I'm not sure how long this all lasted, it couldn't have been more than a minute. Looking up from Tony's bleeding body, Joe slowly turned towards us, and I saw the hurt look on his face. It seemed as if though he was about to speak, but he stopped himself. Then he briskly walked between the two of us and out the back door. The second the door slammed shut, we both ran to Tony. His eyes were starting to roll back in his head, and the pool of blood was growing larger and larger by the second. It wasn't until then I remembered I had my phone in my pocket. I pulled it out and dialed 911. While I spoke to the dispatcher, the other employee gathered up a few towels and packed them around the knife to slow the bleeding. I quickly yelled to the girl running the register to lock the doors because there had been an accident and someone was badly hurt. After she did this, she ran to the back and began screeching when she saw Tony on the floor. The girl helping him on the floor told her to shut up, and she did, and she kept staring at him. The paramedics showed up in less than 5 minutes, and when they loaded Tony up, they said he was stable. We filled the police in on the history of Joe and Tony's relationship and the business. The two of us that had witnessed the stabbing gave a description of Joe, and they picked him up before we had even left the restaurant. They said they found him walking on the other side of the road not a mile away. When they asked who he was, he confessed to the attack and began crying. Once that was taken care of, the waiting began. Day after day, we prayed for Tony's recovery, and after 2 days, he started to improve, but by the end of the week, he passed. It was said that when Joe heard the news, his wailing could be heard throughout the entire jail. Considering his obvious regret, the DA decided to charge Joe with second-degree murder. Joe took a plea deal and will be in prison for at least the next 15 years. Since this happened in 2005, he'll likely be getting out in the next few years. I briefly considered showing up for his parole hearing and arguing against it, but despite his nasty disposition, I know he regrets killing his best friend and will have to live with that till the end of his days. So, I'll just leave it to fate to decide his future, just as it does for us all. I've been urged by those close to me to share my account of a recent life-changing event I experienced while working the drive-thru window at my fast food job. Until this happened, I had yet to fall victim to the irrational anger some carry around all day inside of them. I was unaware of how easily they can be triggered, and now that I have seen it firsthand, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully trust another human again. Although, at this time it is still very difficult for me to relive the event, I am encouraged that, to do so through this post, I may be able to begin to take charge of my life again. I guess I'll start at the beginning in order to make what came next make more sense. My name is Zoe Marie, but my friends call me Zoe. I'm currently 17 and will soon graduate high school a year early because I was allowed to skip ahead a grade when I was younger. In order to instill a strong work ethic into their young daughter, my parents encouraged me to get a job once I had turned 16. Not being one that wanted to disappoint my parents, I soon found a part-time job at a chain burger and fries restaurant near my home. I would often ride my bike the 2 miles after school and work a few hours during the weekdays and longer shifts on weekend evenings. So I had always had all of my things paid for up until that time. Seeing each check filled me with a mixture of awe and achievement. These feelings appear to have done exactly what my parents had hoped and fired my will to work even harder. I'm not sure if this desire spawned from a place of greed. I'm sure the argument could be made. Nonetheless, I did look forward to each shift. My shift that night had started at the counter, but once the girl working the window ended her shift, I was moved to her station. At the time, I had no preference between counter and window. You came into contact with the rude and crude working both, and this night was no different. I had already had a big fat woman with her 3 snotty-nosed children in tow scream at me for making a small mistake in her order. Perhaps the only benefit I did have was that I rarely worked after midnight, so I didn't have to deal with many intoxicated customers that came later. The 1 or 2 times I did work later, I found it a trying experience. I'll keep my moral views to myself. I will only say that I see those who partake of alcohol as weak, and I'll leave it at that. My shift was ending in around an hour when I met my last customer. From the way the gentleman was speaking, I could tell he had been drinking that evening. The transaction was a string of confusion and chaos. He changed the order multiple times, and those in the car with him sounded as confused as him. The entire mess came to a head when I informed him that our shake machine was out of order. At first, I believed that there was something amiss with the headset, but I was wrong. But I promised that night it was certainly broken. When I told him this, I was assaulted with a tirade of curses and derogatory names, and then he went silent. At first, I believed that there was something amiss with the headset, but I was wrong. The quiet was shattered by the squealing of tires. The cry of the tires was almost instantly joined by the roar of gunfire. I still believe to this day the only thing that saved my life was the sound of the tires. When I heard them, I leaned a bit forward in the window, almost putting my head out of the doors. I only expected an angry confrontation at that second. Coming face to face with the barrel of his gun as he extended his arm from his window, I instinctively ran for cover. The countless bangs from the gun and the screams of my fellow employees seemed to last a lifetime. No matter how I tried to drown them out by covering my head with my arms, they remained just as horrifying. I'm not sure when the firing finally stopped, but I didn't even consider raising my head until another of the employees shook me. I guess at the time he was checking to see if I had been struck by any of the bullets, but regardless of his intent, I hesitated a moment before I sat upright. To my dismay, 2 of the others working that night had been injured, and although neither of them died, I couldn't return to that restaurant or any of its kind for quite some time. Just now, over 6 months after this happened, can I finally see a business with a drive-thru window without having a panic attack? In the months since the attack, I have spent a large amount of time and energy in counseling in the hopes of regaining my courage and ability to be a useful member of society again. Whether it's due to feelings of guilt or fear, the road has been a hard one, and if it were not for the sense of purpose and the hard work ethic my parents have helped foster in me, I may not have even made it through school. Despite my heartfelt hopes and many prayers, the police have yet to find or arrest the thugs that attempted to take my life because of a freaking shake machine. The best I can do is continue to have faith in law enforcement and the universal force of right. I know someday, some way, they will be made to pay for what they have done. The only real solace I can find is the fact that no one has lost their lives because of something I did or said. I went to university in a small town, less than 5,000 people. The majority of the population is made up of students, but of course there are also locals. I never had a problem with any of the locals before, but they could be a tad strange. So about 7 months ago, I was at the grocery store around 6 p.m. buying food for dinner. I was in the dairy aisle looking for cottage cheese. We were making lasagna. When, from behind me, this man asked me why I was buying cottage cheese. I turned around, and there was a man standing there, probably in his late 40s, early 50s, with long greasy ponytail and dirty clothes. Something about him made me feel uncomfortable. However, I'm very polite and a little too nice, so I engaged in the conversation with him. I'm making lasagna tonight, and the recipe calls for it. I'm a professional chef. Let me tell you that you should not be using cottage cheese. You should be using ricotta, he says. So I said thanks for the advice and picked up the ricotta. I was about to walk away when he continued conversation. He was going on about really weird things, like how he used to have a white tiger as a pet. I thought he was delusional, and how he makes homemade hot sauce out of his house. At this point, I had probably been standing there listening to him for 20 minutes. Do you like hot sauce? Yeah, sometimes. You should come to my place and make hot sauce with me. I just live up the mountain. No thanks. It's okay. The man starts getting really pushy and trying to persuade me to go to his house. Finally, this woman who was overhearing our weird conversation and who could see I was getting very unnerved said it was time for him to be on his way. He then proceeds to give me his business card, which I may add was clearly homemade on regular printer paper and cut with scissors. He tells me to call him whenever I want to make hot sauce or have a drink. He went to the cashier to pay for his stuff, and I watched to make sure he left before going to pay for my things. When I walked out of the grocery store, he was standing outside waiting for me. Now I'm really freaked out and have a good 15-minute walk ahead of me. He asked me how I was getting home, and I didn't want to say I was walking, so I told him I was going to catch a cab. We'll share a cab. No, just share a cab with me. He was starting to get angry, so I flagged down a cab and I jumped in. He tries to get in the back, but I tell the cab driver that I don't know this man, and I don't want him sharing a cab with me, so he tells him to get lost. As we are driving away, I can hear him yell, "Fucking bitch!" I'm pretty shaken at this point. The cab driver drops me off at my house. When I get out, I see a car with the creepy man from the grocery store in it parked 2 houses down. He not only followed me to my house, but also had a car of his own. There was no reason for him to want to take a taxi with me. Now I was super scared and hurried inside. Thank God my 2 other roommates were both home. I told them everything that happened. One of my roommate's boyfriends was on his way over, so we decided to wait for him to get there before we did anything else. He just stayed there in his car watching our house for a good 15 minutes. When he saw my friend's boyfriend show up, he drove away, and I never saw him since. I then remembered that he gave me his business card, and I wanted to look him up online. First of all, the business card was for some photoshopping company, not chef. I typed the name and business into Google, and nothing came up. His name did not exist, and the company didn't exist either. I reported this incident to the police, but they said there was not much they could do since he didn't technically do anything. I'm not sure if this is related or not, but I have a gut feeling it was. Less than a week later, my roommates had class at 8:30 a.m., and I was still sleeping since I didn't have class until noon. I guess whoever last left forgot to lock the door. About an hour after they left, I woke up to the front door being closed. Thinking it was just one of my roommates, I thought the door would have been locked, so whoever it was would have needed a key. I just stayed in bed. I heard someone go into my roommate's room right next to mine, thinking it was her. And then a few moments later, I hear someone try my door. I lock it when I sleep at night and knock. But I was so tired I didn't want to get up and open it, so I just pretended to be asleep. Well, thank God for that, because none of my roommates were home, and it was actually an intruder. I heard whoever it was leave through the back door, which I thought was weird, so I got up and got dressed, and when I went out, no one was there. But turns out whoever it was stole my roommate's laptop and a picture we have in our living room of us 4 girls. Creepy. I reported all this to the police but never really heard anything back of it. I had lots of trouble sleeping and feeling safe in my own house after this incident. To this day, this experience creeps me out, and I don't want to imagine what would have happened if I opened my bedroom door to whoever was knocking. When I was younger, my mom and I used to ride bikes around my neighborhood together. One day, we decided to pick up some stuff at the local grocery store. When I was walking down the aisle, a man approached my mom and I. He was tall and bald. I can't remember much about his appearance. I was about 13 years old. He asked my mom if she had any other children, to which she replied yes, my brother of 4 at the time. However, keep in mind, all she said was she had a 4-year-old. Anyhow, the man gave her some business cards and told me to have a nice day. He seemed incredibly nice, in my opinion. About a week later, my mom and I were at the store again, and yes, we rode bike there. The man was there, but he was walking around with an empty shopping cart. He called out to my mom, but my mom kept nudging me to leave. "Elizabeth, wait!" he yelled. He approached us and asked how Sebastian, my brother, was. My mom said he was fine, but we were in a hurry, so she told him we had to leave. She had a panicked look on her face when we got outside, so I asked her what was wrong. She told me that she never told him my brother's name. That's when things started getting weird. Later that night, we went back to the store in a car this time. It was raining, but we never got to buy anything either, because we left. When we got there, the man was still there. He was still walking around with an empty shopping cart. My mom was creeped out, so she told me we'd come back in the morning. When we got to the car, it was freezing, so while we were waiting for the car to heat up, someone knocked on the car window. It was the man. I started screaming, and my mom put the car in reverse. When she reversed, the man ran in front of the car. She lowered her window a bit and told him to leave. "I just want to talk to you," he would shout, but my mom just drove around him. Finally, the next morning, we decided to go back to the store. We walked there. When we got there, the strange man was there. My mom went up to a security guard and told him everything. The security guard said he'd noticed the man a while back and has been waiting for someone to make a formal complaint. He said he knew exactly who the man was. It turns out he was just released from a mental hospital and his son was in jail for rape. He told us that he always comes to hit on women and stays there all day without ever buying anything. The officer then made a call and told us he'd watch out for the man to make sure he didn't follow us out. When we were crossing the street out of the grocery store parking lot, about 7 cop cars showed up and pulled out in front of the grocery store. The next time we went to the store, my mom asked the security guard what had happened, and he told us the man was taken into custody. Apparently, they had a warrant for his arrest, and he had a stolen gun on his person.
I've worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals and facilities. Before the current hospital I work at, I worked at a geriatric hospital 30 minutes from my house. I had experience working with older patients before, so this was nothing new to me. I had been working at this hospital for only a couple of weeks, and you'll soon understand why. This was on my second to last shift at this hospital, unbeknownst to me at the start of that night. I was working the graveyard shift, and I was running on negative hours of sleep. I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward absolutely adored me. My presence as a young girl in her 20s among the residents of this ward who were otherwise left to themselves to float around in their minds, I'm sure saw me as a breath of fresh air, someone who could tie them to the now or to the everyday. If you're just left to yourself, you can mentally go to other places, but with someone else in your space, you're tied to that moment in time. I was dealing with a number of patients that night, but one was a little more restless than the others. Her name was Lena. This was my first night dealing with her, and she kept telling me anytime I'd enter her room about the voices she kept hearing and the man dressed in black she kept seeing in the corner of the room. The other lady in her room requested her curtain be closed before my shift started so that Lena would leave her alone. She was a sweet lady that smiled whenever I was around her, but she didn't say much and was very forgetful. Since I started my shift around 9 p.m., most of the patients were asleep by 11, but not Lena. Whenever she called me into the room, she'd be frightened of these alleged voices she was hearing, and the man in black that kept staring at her in the corner of the room. Not gonna lie, it was creeping me out a little. I believed that in her mind she was seeing and hearing these things, and I sympathized with her because I imagined them to be very scary. But still, I tried my best to calm her down and get her to go to sleep. I didn't want to turn on the TV to calm her down because I wanted to be courteous of the other patient in the room. I held Lena's hands and told her it's okay, to breathe and to relax. I reminded her that she wasn't here alone, and I was always just a call away. This seemed to do the trick. Lena relaxed for a while, and the next time I came in the room, she was asleep. Once most, if not all, of the patients are asleep, the night goes much slower. Time almost moves in reverse. An hour or two later, I was in the linen room stocking my cart when I heard something in the room. It was a relatively small, dead quiet room. I had the door closed too. That's why hearing another noise was weird. I turned, saw nothing, and resumed stocking my cart. Then I felt what I can only describe to be a hand on my shoulder. I looked at my shoulder, jumped, and screamed, but there was nothing on my shoulder. There was no one in the room. Yet I knew I felt something large basically grab my shoulder. I went out in the hall for a second to peek my head. No other nurses in sight. Dead quiet. I had nothing else to do but resume what I was doing. I continued stocking the cart until it was full. Then I turned to face the door, and I fell to the floor and started screaming as my heart was immediately in my throat. There was a man dressed in black standing outside the door, looking through the glass, smiling. My screams were loud enough to wake the entire ward. The man disappeared out of sight through the glass window of the door. Seconds later, the door opened and one of my fellow nurses came in to help me off the floor as I was hysterical. I asked her if she saw the man dressed in black. Her response was, "What man? There's no one else here." We checked all the rooms in the ward. There wasn't anybody dressed in black in there. My screams woke Lena from whatever light sleep she must have been in, and when I came into her room, she started talking of the voices. This time the screams, which she didn't know were my screams. I asked her what this man in black looked like, if he was smiling. And she looked at me, and I noticed her eyebrows point down, as her expression changed to look the most focused I'd seen her the entire day. She asked, "How did you know?" And even with my heart still racing, I felt it skip a beat as she said this. She started screaming now, screaming, "Get me out of here, he's coming." The other nurses came in and tried to calm her down. I was switched to a different ward that night with someone else, and I eventually ended up going home early because I was just so freaked out. I texted the head nurse the next day that my next shift would be my last, that the experience traumatized me and that I didn't really want to be in that building anymore. I've never been diagnosed with anything, nor have I ever dealt with hallucinations of any kind. I'm aware of the effects of lack of sleep, but this was next level. I don't know if my mind started playing tricks on me from what Lena was telling me all night, but the feeling of the hand on my shoulder, the image of the smiling man behind the glass door, matching the description a patient kept giving multiple times. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime, unexplainable supernatural occurrences. At least, I hope it was once in a lifetime. 3 years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida. I don't believe there was an outbreak going on or anything, so I'm not sure how I caught it or who I could have caught it from. I started developing really bad symptoms: painful headaches, confusion, sleepiness, nausea, and lack of appetite. But when the hallucinations started, that's when I knew I had something really serious. Laying sick in bed while my husband was at work, I heard a child's voice call Mom from downstairs. Mom! We don't have any kids. I dragged myself out of bed to look down the stairway to call my husband's name. Of course, he didn't answer because he was at work. The headache I had from standing was too much, so I went back to bed. For a second time, I heard a voice call from downstairs. It said hello. Hello. I picked up the phone and called my husband, freaking out to him into the phone that I was hearing a scary child's voice from inside the house, and that I thought I was hallucinating. He heard how distressed I was over the phone, and so he left work early to bring me to the hospital. While waiting for him to get home, I changed out of my pajamas, and while doing so, I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. As I was mid-throwing up, I heard another voice from outside of the bathroom. I couldn't hear what it might have said, nor could I tell if it sounded the same as the other voice I heard. I was losing my mind. I wasn't diagnosed until I arrived at the hospital, and apparently, if untreated, what I had could be very serious, even fatal. The doctor told me the hallucinations part was rather unusual, but not unheard of. I was given antibiotics through a needle shortly after I arrived at the hospital with my husband. The doctor told me that I was fortunate to have come to the hospital so quickly, as if I had waited much longer, this could have had lasting effects or possibly have been fatal. My husband stayed with me for a few hours in the room. I was told I was going to have to stay there for a few days to a week, given the severity of my symptoms. Around 10 o'clock, my husband left to go home, as he had work the next day. The nurse told me call her if I should have any issues. Though I still felt like absolute death, I nodded off pretty quickly. I started having this dream where my ex-husband was in the room, over my bed, looking down at me, talking. He was saying horrible things about my current husband. He patted my head and said he was glad I was okay, and that he came as soon as he saw my husband left. He went into this rant about how he despises my current husband and wants to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead, then left the room. I often have bad dreams about my ex-husband because of how toxic and abusive our marriage was, and why it ended, which I'd rather not include. I woke up in this drowsy, lightheaded state and looked around the room. There was a chair pulled up in front of my hospital bed, but no one was sitting in it. It wasn't like that when my husband left. It was still the middle of the night, so I went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning to the nurse in the room. I told her about the weirdly vivid dream I had, and she laughed and told me that wasn't a dream, that my cousin came to visit me last night. I told her I don't have any cousins that live in this state. She looked more serious now and said, "Well, someone who said they're your cousin David visited you late last night." David was the name of my ex-husband. After explaining better, the nurse got a doctor, and the doctor told me the antibiotics may have caused delirium, which hindered my ability to recognize sleep from wakefulness, hence why I was so vividly hearing what David was saying. I called my husband to tell him what happened, and of course he was livid and concerned. He came back again that night after work. But that day, I texted David, asking what the hell he was thinking visiting me, and how did he know I was in the hospital. My text delivered, but he ignored it. I sent a follow-up, telling him I heard all of his threats towards my husband and that I'd be getting police involved. And minutes later, he responded saying, "I never made any threats towards your husband. I was simply there when I heard what happened to make sure you were okay. You must have heard things in your sleep." I responded, "Stay out of my life or I'll get police involved again." He didn't respond after this. I never told my husband about the threats I heard in my drowsy half-asleep state, because I didn't know if they were real or not. With a mix of the antibiotics and my already having weird audible hallucinations the day before, I don't think it's impossible that what I heard wasn't actually what was said. But I could be wrong. I left the hospital the next week.